You know who you are. Not the person you show at work, not the person you are around your family, not the version you perform on social media. I'm talking about the real you, the one you think about at 3 a.m., the one who has opinions you'd never say out loud, the one who wants things you've never admitted to anyone, the one who's capable of things that would scare the people who think they know you. You know exactly who that person is, and you're terrified of them. Not because they're dangerous, but because they're real. And if you let them out, if you actually became that person, everything would change. The relationships that are barely holding together would collapse. The identity you've spent years building would crumble. The safety you've constructed around yourself would disappear. So you keep them buried, you perform the acceptable version. You wear the mask so well that sometimes you forget it's a mask at all. But here's what Carl Jung understood that most people never will. That person you're afraid to be, that's not your enemy, that's who you actually are. And the version you're performing right now, Jung called that the persona. It's the character you play to survive in the world, to be accepted, to be safe, to avoid conflict. But it's not you. And every day you spend performing it, you're dying a little, not physically, psychologically. You're burying the self that wants to emerge, and that burial, it has consequences. Jung believed that the greatest tragedy of human existence isn't death. It's living your entire life as someone you're not. It's getting to the end and realizing you never actually lived. You just performed, you just survived, you just played the role everyone expected. This video is about what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are instead of who the world needs you to be. It's about the person you're afraid to become, why you're afraid of them, what happens if you keep hiding, and what it actually takes to stop performing and start being. This isn't self-help, this isn't motivation, this is psychology, raw, uncomfortable, and necessary. Let's go. Let's start with the mask. Jung called it the persona from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. It's the version of yourself you present to the world, the professional, the friend, the partner, the good son, the successful person, the one who has it together. And here's the thing, the persona isn't fake, it's functional, you need it, society requires it. You can't walk into a job interview and be your raw, unfiltered self. You can't show up to family dinner and say everything you actually think. You can't exist in the world without some degree of performance. The problem isn't that you have a persona, the problem is when you become it. When the mask becomes so comfortable that you forget it's a mask. When you've performed the role so long that you start believing that's who you are. When the person you show the world becomes the only person you know how to be. That's when the persona becomes a prison. Here's what that looks like in practice. You're successful, but you feel empty. You hit the milestones. You got the degree, the job, the title, the relationship. Everyone thinks you're doing great, but inside, nothing. You feel like you're watching your own life from the outside, like you're playing a character in a movie you didn't write. You can't remember the last time you made a choice for you. Every decision is filtered through. What will people think? What's expected of me? What's the smart move? You've optimized your life for external approval, but you've lost track of what you actually want. You're exhausted from performing. Every interaction feels like work. Every conversation requires you to monitor yourself. You're constantly managing your image, your tone, your words, and when you're alone, you collapse because maintaining the persona is exhausting. You resent the people who love your persona. They praise you. They tell you how great you are, but you know they're not praising you. They're praising the version you're showing them. And deep down, you resent them for it, because if they knew the real you, the messy, uncertain, contradictory version, they'd leave. Jung believed that the persona is dangerous not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. It's a fragment of who you are. And when you live only as that fragment, the rest of you, the parts that don't fit the role, they don't disappear. They go underground. Into the shadow. But before we go there, you need to understand something critical. The persona isn't the enemy. The enemy is identification with the persona. It's believing that the mask is your face. It's forgetting that there's a self underneath. And once you forget that, you're not living, you're performing, and you'll perform until you die, unless you wake up. So why don't you just take the mask off? Why don't you just be yourself? Because you're terrified of what happens if you do. Let's be specific about what you're actually afraid of. Rejection, the persona is built for acceptance. It's designed to make people like you, respect you, need you, but the real you, the one underneath, you're not sure anyone would accept them. You're not sure they'd be enough, so you keep performing, because the persona gets love, and you're terrified that the real you wouldn't. Chaos, the persona is stable, it's predictable. You know how to be that person. You've practiced it for years, but the real you don't know them yet. You don't know what they want, what they believe, what they're capable of. And that uncertainty is terrifying, because if you stop being the person you've always been, you have no idea who you'll become. Consequences: if you became who you actually are, everything would change. The job that looks good on paper but drains you, you'd have to leave. The relationship that's comfortable but not real, you'd have to end it. The family expectations you've been carrying, you'd have to disappoint them. And the thought of blowing up your entire life just to be yourself, that feels impossible. The shadow, because here's the part no one talks about. You're not just afraid of who you are, you're afraid of who you could be, the parts of yourself you've been suppressing, the anger, the selfishness, the ambition, the darkness. Jung called this the shadow, the parts of yourself you've disowned because they don't fit the persona. And you're terrified that if you take the mask off, the shadow will come out too, and you won't be able to control it. So you stay hidden, you keep performing, because performing feels safer than becoming. But here's what Jung understood: the fear isn't protecting you, it's killing you. Because every day you spend as the persona, you're abandoning the self. Every decision you make for approval instead of truth, you're betraying yourself. Every time you shrink to fit someone else's expectations, you're reinforcing the prison. And over time, that abandonment compounds, it builds, it festers, until one day you look in the mirror and you don't recognize yourself, because the person staring back isn't you, it's the mask, and you've worn it so long you've forgotten there's a face underneath. That's the cost of safety, that's the price of staying hidden. And Jung believed it's the most dangerous psychological state you can be in, because when you're disconnected from your true self, you're not fully alive, you're just surviving, going through the motions, waiting for permission to exist. But permission isn't coming, because no one can give you permission to be yourself. That's a choice only you can make. Let's talk about the part you've been avoiding. Jung called it the shadow, the collection of traits, desires, and impulses you've rejected because they don't align with the persona. The parts of yourself you've labeled as bad, wrong, or unacceptable. And here's what makes the shadow so dangerous: it doesn't go away just because you reject it. It goes underground into your unconscious, and from there it influences everything. Your decisions, your relationships, your self-sabotage, the patterns you can't break, the emotions you can't control, the behaviors you can't explain. The shadow is why you do things that don't make sense, why you sabotage good opportunities, why you pick fights you don't need to pick, why you feel resentment you can't articulate, why you're drawn to people who hurt you, why you repeat the same mistakes over and over. Because the shadow operates through you, whether you acknowledge it or not. Here's what the shadow looks like in real life. Projection: you see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. The coworker you hate for being arrogant, that's your own unexpressed ambition. The friend you resent for being selfish, that's your own suppressed need for boundaries. The traits you can't stand in others, those are the traits you've disowned in yourself. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's the shadow talking. Repression leak: you're calm, rational, controlled, until you're not, until something small triggers you and suddenly you're raging. Or you're fine, totally fine, until one comment breaks you and you're sobbing. Those disproportionate reactions, that's the shadow. It's been building pressure underground, and when it finally breaks through, it's explosive. Self-sabotage: you get close to success, then you blow it up. You meet someone good for you, then you push them away. You build something, then you destroy it. Why? Because your shadow doesn't believe you deserve it. Because the persona says you're disciplined, but the shadow knows you're scared, and the shadow will sabotage you before you can fail publicly. Addiction and compulsion: the things you can't stop doing, the behaviors you hide, the vices you rationalize, those aren't character flaws, they're shadow expressions. The parts of you that need something: release, validation, control, escape, and because you won't address them consciously, they take what they need unconsciously. Jung believed that most people spend their entire lives running from the shadow. They bury it, they deny it, they project it onto others. They perform the persona harder to prove the shadow doesn't exist. But it does, and it's not going anywhere. And here's the uncomfortable truth: the person you're afraid to become isn't just the persona dropping away, it's the shadow integrating. Because becoming who you actually are doesn't mean becoming the good version of yourself. It means becoming the whole version, the light and the dark, the disciplined and the chaotic, the kind and the ruthless. Jung said, I'd rather be whole than good, because wholeness requires acknowledging the parts of yourself you've been taught to hate, and most people would rather stay fragmented and acceptable than become whole and real. But if you want to become who you're afraid to be, you don't get to skip the shadow. You have to go through it. Let's be honest about what happens if you don't do this work, if you keep performing, if you keep hiding, if you keep running from the person you're afraid to become. Because the cost isn't abstract, it's real, and it compounds. You lose time, years, decades. You look back and realize you spent your entire 20s trying to be what your parents wanted, your 30s trying to be what your partner needed, your 40s trying to be what society expected. And now you're 50, 60, 70, and you never actually lived. You just performed, and you can't get that time back. You lose relationships, not the shallow ones, those stay. The people who benefit from your persona, who need you to play the role, they'll stick around. But the real connections, the ones that require authenticity, vulnerability, depth, you lose those because you can't build real intimacy while wearing a mask. And the people who could have loved the real you, they never get the chance because they never meet them. You lose energy. The persona is exhausting to maintain. Every interaction requires performance. Every decision requires calculation. Every moment requires monitoring. And over time, you're just tired, burnt out, numb, because you're spending all your energy pretending, and you have nothing left for actually living. You lose yourself. This is the worst part. The longer you wear the mask, the harder it becomes to take it off, because you forget there's a face underneath. You forget who you actually are. Your real desires get buried so deep you can't access them. Your real opinions get suppressed so long you don't trust them. Your real self becomes a stranger, and you spend the rest of your life feeling like you're watching someone else live your life. You become resentful. You resent the people who expect you to be the persona. You resent the world for not accepting the real you. You resent yourself for not having the courage to change, and that resentment, it poisons everything. Your work, your relationships, your internal world. You become bitter, cynical, angry, not because life is hard, but because you're living the wrong life. You self-destruct. Eventually the pressure becomes too much. The shadow breaks through, the persona cracks, and when it does, it's messy. Midlife crisis, affairs, addictions, breakdowns, explosions, not because you're weak, but because you've been compressing yourself for so long that when you finally break, it's catastrophic. Jung said the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And he was right, because accepting yourself, becoming who you actually are, requires you to face everything you've been avoiding, the fear, the shadow, the consequences. But here's what he also knew: the alternative is worse. Because if you don't become who you're afraid to be, you become who you're afraid of becoming. The person who wasted their life, the person who played it safe and died with their music still inside them, the person who got to the end and realized they never actually lived. That's the cost of staying hidden, and it's not worth it. So how do you actually do this? How do you stop performing and start being? How do you become who you're afraid to be? Jung called the process individuation, the journey of becoming your true self, and it's not a single decision. It's not a moment of clarity. It's a process, long, uncomfortable, and irreversible. Here's how it actually works. Awareness, recognizing the mask. You can't take off a mask you don't know you're wearing. The first stage is simply noticing the persona, noticing when you're performing, noticing when you're saying what you think you should say instead of what you actually think, noticing when you're making decisions based on approval instead of truth. This sounds simple. It's not, because the persona is automatic. You've been performing it so long it feels natural. So the first work is just catching yourself in real time, mid-conversation, mid-decision, and asking, is this me or is this the mask? That question alone changes everything. Confrontation, meeting the shadow. Once you see the mask, you start to see what's underneath, and that's where the shadow appears. This stage is brutal because the shadow is everything you've been running from, the anger you've suppressed, the desires you've denied, the parts of yourself you've labeled as bad. And Jung's instruction here is simple but terrifying: stop running. Stop projecting, stop denying, stop pretending it's not there, turn around, look at it, acknowledge it. Not to become it, but to integrate it. Because the shadow isn't evil, it's disowned, and when you disown parts of yourself, they don't disappear, they just operate unconsciously. But when you own them, when you bring them into consciousness, you gain choice. You're no longer controlled by them, you choose how to engage with them. That's integration, and it's the hardest work you'll ever do. Dissolution, letting the persona die. Once you've confronted the shadow, you can't go back to the persona. You've seen too much, you know too much. And this is where most people get stuck, because they want to add the real self to the persona. They want to be authentic and keep everyone happy. They want to integrate the shadow and maintain their image. But that's not how it works. Jung said individuation requires a death, the death of the persona, the death of the identity you've been performing, the death of the version of yourself that everyone loves. And that death is grief. You grieve the relationships that can't survive your authenticity. You grieve the identity that kept you safe. You grieve the life you thought you were supposed to live. But on the other side of that death, there's space, space for the real you to emerge. Integration, becoming whole. This is where you stop being fragmented and start being whole. Not just persona, not just shadow, but both, integrated, conscious, chosen. You're no longer performing, you're not hiding, you're just being fully, unapologetically. And here's what that looks like. You stop needing approval, not because you don't care what people think, but because you're no longer willing to betray yourself for their comfort. Their opinions matter less than your integrity. You make decisions from your center, not from fear, not from obligation, not from what's expected, but from what's actually true for you, even when it's hard, even when it costs you. You stop apologizing for who you are, you stop shrinking, you stop explaining, you stop performing, you just exist, and you let people accept you or leave, because you'd rather be alone and real than surrounded and fake. You stop projecting the shadow, you own your darkness, your anger, your selfishness, your ambition. You don't act on every impulse, but you don't deny them either. You hold them consciously, and you choose how to engage with them. You become sovereign not over others, over yourself, over your own chaos, over your own life. You stop waiting for permission, you stop looking for validation, you just live from your center on your terms. That's individuation, that's becoming who you're afraid to be. The return, living as the integrated self. The final stage isn't transcendence, it's return. You don't leave the world, you re-enter it, but you're different now. You're not performing, you're not hiding, you're just present. And here's what Jung knew that most people miss. The world doesn't end when you become yourself. The people who loved your function, they leave. The relationships built on performance, they collapse. The identity that kept you safe, it dissolves. But what remains is real. The people who stay aren't staying for your persona, they're staying for you. The work you do isn't for approval, it's for meaning. The life you live isn't for validation, it's for truth. In that life, it's smaller, quieter, less impressive from the outside. But from the inside, it's alive. And that's worth everything you lose. Let me tell you what no one prepares you for, the space between the persona dying and the real self emerging. Jung called it the dark night of the soul, and it feels exactly like dying. Because you're not the person you were, but you're not yet the person you're becoming. You're in the void, the liminal space, the in-between. And it's terrifying. Here's what the dark night looks like. You don't recognize yourself. You used to know who you were. You had a role, an identity, a function, but now, nothing. You're not the high performer anymore. You're not the helper. You're not the person everyone depends on. So who are you? You don't know, and that not knowing is disorienting. You lose interest in everything. The things you used to care about feel hollow. The goals you were chasing feel meaningless. The relationships you were maintaining feel exhausting, not because you're depressed, but because those things were tied to the persona, and the persona is dead. You isolate, you can't be around people the way you used to. You can't perform, you can't pretend, you can't show up as the version they expect, so you withdraw, not because you want to, but because you don't know how to be around them anymore. You question everything, your career, your relationships, your values, your beliefs. Everything you thought you knew feels unstable because it was built on the persona, and now that foundation is gone. You feel guilty for not being who you were, for disappointing people, for letting them down, for changing. The guilt is crushing because you still believe your worth is tied to your function, and if you're not functioning, what are you? This is the void and you can't skip it. Most people hit this stage in panic. They try to go back. They rebuild the persona. They apologize for changing. They shrink back into the role because the void is too uncomfortable. But Jung would say, stay in the void. Because this is where the transformation happens, not in the light, not in the clarity, but in the darkness, in the not knowing, in the space where the old self has died and the new self hasn't been born. You have to sit there, you have to not know, you have to let yourself be nothing for a while. And eventually, if you don't run, something new emerges. Not the persona, not the shadow, but you, the real, integrated, whole version of yourself that's been buried your entire life. But you can't force it, you can't rush it, you just have to trust the process. Trust that on the other side of the death, there's life. Because there is, but you have to go through the death first. So what do you become on the other side? Jung didn't call it enlightenment, he didn't call it self-actualization. He called it the self, capital S, the integrated, individuated, sovereign version of who you actually are. And here's what that looks like in practice. You stop performing not because you're rude or careless, but because you're no longer willing to betray yourself for external approval. You show up as you are, and if that's not enough for someone, you let them leave. You stop apologizing for your existence. You stop shrinking. You stop explaining. You stop justifying your choices. You just exist fully, unapologetically, and you trust that the right people will accept you, and the wrong people won't, and both outcomes are fine. You make decisions from your center, not from fear, not from obligation, not from what will people think, but from what's true for me, even when it's hard, even when it costs you relationships, opportunities, approval. You integrate the shadow. You're not at war with your darkness anymore. You're not denying your anger, your ambition, your selfishness. You own it, you hold it consciously, and you choose how to engage with it. You're not controlled by it, but you're not running from it either. You become discerning. You don't care about everyone's opinion anymore. You care about specific people's opinions, the people who see you, the people who earn access to you. Everyone else, their approval doesn't move you, their criticism doesn't break you, because you're anchored in yourself, not in their perception of you. You stop waiting for permission. You stop waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to want what you want, to be who you are, to live the life you're meant to live. You just do it, not recklessly, but sovereignly, because you've realized no one's coming to give you permission, and you don't need it. You become a presence, not a performance. People feel the difference when they're around you. You're not trying to impress them. You're not managing their emotions. You're not performing likability. You're just present, grounded, real, and that presence is magnetic, not to everyone, but to the right people. Jung said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and he was right. Because being yourself, the real, integrated, whole version, isn't just freedom, it's power. Not power over others, power over yourself, over your own chaos, over your own life. You're no longer reactive, you're no longer performing, you're no longer waiting, you're no longer hiding. You're just sovereign. And that sovereignty, it's not arrogance, it's not superiority, it's self-possession. It's knowing who you are, owning all of it, light and dark, and living from that center, unapologetically. That's what you become, that's who you're afraid to be. And once you become them, you realize you were never afraid of them. You were afraid of what it would cost to become them. But now you know the cost of not becoming them is higher. Let me end with the uncomfortable truth. Becoming who you're afraid to be doesn't make life easier. It doesn't make you happier. It doesn't make people like you more. In fact, it usually makes things harder. Because when you stop performing, people get uncomfortable. The family members who benefited from your compliance, they'll call you selfish. The friends who needed you to stay small, they'll call you arrogant. The partners who loved your sacrifice, they'll call you cold. And they won't understand because they never saw the prison you were living in. They only saw the performance. And from their perspective, you changed. You became someone else. But you didn't become someone else. You stopped pretending. And that's the part they can't forgive, because your authenticity reminds them of their own performance. Your freedom highlights their own prison. Your sovereignty exposes their own hiding. So they'll push back, they'll guilt you, they'll try to shame you back into the role. And here's the test: will you go back? Will you shrink again to make them comfortable? Will you apologize for becoming yourself? Will you rebuild the persona because the consequences of being real are too hard? Most people do. They go back, they rebuild, they apologize for trying to be themselves, and they spend the rest of their lives wondering what if. But if you don't, if you stay as yourself, even when it costs you everything, something shifts. The people who are holding you hostage with their expectations, they leave, and that hurts, but it also frees you. The relationships built on performance, they collapse, and that's painful, but it also makes space for real ones. The identity that kept you safe, it dissolves, and that's terrifying, but it also allows the real you to breathe. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, you realize you didn't lose anything real. You only lost what was never yours in the first place. The approval that required you to betray yourself, that wasn't love. The relationships that demanded your silence, those weren't connections. The identity that kept you small, that wasn't you. And now that it's gone, there's space. Space for the life you're actually supposed to live. Space for the relationships that see you. Space for the work that means something. Space for you. Jung said your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. This is the awakening, not to some higher truth, not to some spiritual plane, but to yourself, to the person you've been your entire life but were too afraid to become. And the moment you stop being afraid, the moment you choose to become them anyway, despite the cost, everything changes. Not externally, your life might get smaller, quieter, less impressive. but internally you're finally alive. And that's worth everything. So what does life look like on the other side? After you've confronted the shadow, after you've let the persona die, after you've sat in the void, after you've integrated, after you've become. What's left? Jung called this the return because individuation isn't about leaving the world, it's about re-entering it, but as yourself this time, not as the mask, not as the role, but as the integrated, sovereign, whole version of who you are. And here's what that actually looks like. You re-engage, but differently. You don't isolate forever. You don't reject society. You don't become a hermit. You come back, but you're not performing anymore. You're just present. You do the work. You show up for people. You participate, but you're boundaried. You're clear. You're real. You build a different life, not the one you thought you were supposed to build, the one that's actually yours, the career that aligns with your values, not your parents' expectations, the relationships that see you, not your function, the daily rhythm that suits you, not the hustle culture narrative. You lose some people, you gain others. The friends who needed you to stay small, they're gone, and that hurt. But the people who stay, or the new people who arrive, they're real. They don't need you to perform, they don't need you to shrink, they just want you, as you are, and that reciprocity, it's rare, and it's everything. You stop chasing external validation, not because you're above it, but because you're anchored internally. The promotion, the praise, the recognition, they're nice, but they don't define you anymore. You're no longer organizing your life around getting them. You're organizing your life around meaning, and that shift changes everything. You make different choices, choices that don't make sense to other people. You turn down opportunities that don't align. You walk away from relationships that require your silence. You pursue things that matter to you even if they're not impressive, and people think you're crazy, but you're not. You're just finally living your life instead of theirs. You become comfortable with discomfort because individuation doesn't end, you don't arrive. You don't become perfectly integrated and then coast. The shadow keeps showing up, the persona tries to rebuild, the world keeps demanding performance, but now you have practice, you know how to catch yourself, you know how to choose yourself, you know how to stay real even when it's hard. You stop explaining yourself. You used to justify every choice, every boundary, every decision that didn't align with expectations. But now, you just live, and if people don't understand, that's okay, because you're not responsible for their understanding. You're only responsible for your integrity. Jung believed that the individuated person doesn't transcend the world. They just stop being controlled by it. They engage fully. They contribute. They love. They work. They create. But they do it from themselves, not from fear, not from obligation, not from performance. From center, from sovereignty, from truth. And that changes everything. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you become whole. So here's the question only you can answer. Who are you afraid to become? Not in theory, not in the abstract, in practice, right now, today. What version of yourself are you suppressing? What desires are you denying? What truths are you not saying? What life are you not living? And why? What are you protecting by staying hidden? What are you gaining by performing? What are you avoiding by staying small? Is it worth it? Because here's what Jung knew that most people never learn. You only get one life, one shot, one chance to become who you actually are. And every day you spend as the persona, you're losing time. Every year you spend performing, you're losing yourself. And you can keep doing it, you can keep hiding, you can keep playing the role, you can make it to the end without ever taking the mask off. But you won't make it to the end without regret. Because on your deathbed you won't regret the risks you took, you'll regret the ones you didn't, you won't regret the times you were yourself, you'll regret the times you weren't. You'll regret the life you didn't live, the person you didn't become, the truth you didn't speak. Jung said the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. It is just these intense conflicts and their conflagration which are needed to produce valuable and lasting results. The conflict isn't external, it's internal. It's between the person you're performing and the person you actually are. And you can avoid that conflict, you can keep the peace, you can stay comfortable. But you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had the courage to be yourself. Or you can face it, you can stop performing, you can become who you're afraid to be. And yes, it will cost you, yes, it will hurt, yes, you'll lose people, yes, you'll grieve, yes, you'll sit in the void, yes, you'll question everything. But on the other side, freedom, wholeness, sovereignty, life. The real kind, the kind you don't have to perform. So who are you afraid to become? And when are you going to stop being afraid? You know who you are. The real you, the one underneath the mask. Jung believed most people spend their entire lives hiding that person, performing, surviving, playing the role. But you don't have to. You can become who you're afraid to be. Not someday, not when it's safe, not when people approve. Now, today, despite the cost. Because the cost of staying hidden is higher. And you already know that. So stop performing. Start being. Become who you're afraid to be. That's individuation, that's sovereignty, that's life.